We can start, Raul.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raúl Villagrasa, and I'm a researcher at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid. I welcome all of you to this session number 7 of the International Network for the History of Hospitals conference, this time held virtually, but based in Lisbon, and sponsored by the 2 research projects, Hospitalis, Hospital Architecture in Portugal at the Dawn of Modernity, and Royal Hospital of All Saints, City and Public Health. In the next hour and a half, we will enjoy 3 individual papers by Michaela Clark, Antonio Coelho Rodriguez, and Linji Tsai. But first, let me briefly recall the characteristics of these sessions in this conference. The presentations will take place without interruptions. We reserve the debate and questions for later, for the end. I invite you to use the chat to leave your doubts, comments, and questions in writings at any time. Each paper will last a maximum of 20 minutes. I will inform the 3 participants when they have exceeded more or less 18 minutes. So in this session entitled Colonial and Indigenous Models, we will have the opportunity to travel through Africa, America, and Asia. We start with Michaela Clark. She's going to present the paper Designing the Clinic, Racialized Architecture, and the All Good Sure Hospital. She is a second-year PhD candidate at the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Manchester, and her prior academic training lies in visual culture, with studies conducted through Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Her main research focused in the history of clinical photography in a general sense, and the Apartheid era in South Africa, the epistemic violence, and the contemporary redress in a particular sense. So please, Michaela, you have 20 minutes.
Great, thank you, Raul. Thanks, can everyone hear me? All right, perfect. Perfect. I'm going to read, so I'm just going to be turning my head a little bit this way. Just a quick note on the paper I'm presenting today is that it does use racialized language. Some of it is broadly colonial, but some of it is South African specific. So please do keep that in mind as I read my paper. All right, so the graphic planning, physical structure, and spatial administration of general hospitals necessarily take various needs into account. Those of individual departments, the kinds of bodies to be housed, as well as the impetus to ensure both a sanitary environment and a cost-effective build. In the history of hospital design, the layout and appearance of clinical buildings have thus seen shifts in line with changes in opinion surrounding what may or may not ensure the state of health. What I would like to address today is how hospital design in South Africa was notably affected by not only national but regional attitudes towards race in the decades leading up to the implementation of apartheid, using 3 case studies. While the history of the Old Grootskeur, the hospital mentioned in my title, has been thoroughly addressed by historians Anne Digby and Howard Phillips, this presentation is an attempt to situate the architectural makeup of this and other clinical institutions in a country-wide debate about racial segregation in healthcare spaces. So apartheid, for those unfamiliar with the South African context, was the state ideology of this country from 1948 until 1994, and described a period when the National Party implemented and sustained white minority rule. While racial segregation was practiced prior to this period, the noteworthy shift to apartheid is that racial segregation was written into law and systematically implemented even in the so-called Liberal Cape, a part of the country largely under British rule until 1910. Segregation was enforced by numerous acts, including the Population Registration Act that classified South Africans from birth into 3 distinct racial groups: white, coloured, and Bantu, or Black African. The Group Areas Act that segregated both residential and business spaces, and the Separate Amenities Act that segregated public transport and institutions, including hospitals. Ultimately, apartheid-era policies ensured not only separate, but fundamentally unequal development, the results of which can still be seen in South Africa today. The history of medicine in South Africa is overrun with race-based assumptions. The conflation of otherness and pathology has seen Black South Africans in particular deemed both medically and socially contagious. As Maynard Swanson has famously shown via his concept sanitation syndrome, segregationist solutions to the 1901 bubonic plague cemented socio-political fears of influx control, prompting legislative action against Black people in this country. White anxieties of racial intermingling and miscegenation were thus translated into medical fears and spatial practices, giving material form to metaphors of swamping and contamination. Symbolism of this kind continued to flourish well into the 20th century and was joined by other long-held conceptions of the physical susceptibility of Black and First Nation South Africans to the perils of urban civilized living. The corollary to this was the subsequent risk Black people were deemed to pose to whites. In a telling excerpt from The Sick African, physician and professor Michael Galfond stated that, quote, "In view of the fact that all domestic service is performed by natives, it is most necessary to safeguard the health of the African if the European, white settler, is to enjoy his own. Many illnesses, such as tuberculosis and venereal disease, are easily spread from one race to the other." End quote. As Mary Douglas suggests, pollution anxieties exist to reinforce and safeguard the status quo. In her words, the laws of nature are dragged in to sanction the moral code, end quote. Metaphors of contamination thus prompt rituals of which she calls dirt avoidance, methods of keeping both biological and social matter fundamentally in their place. Considering the discursive conflation of the Black body with contagion versus the white body with vulnerability, it is thus no surprise that these racialized attitudes made their mark on the design of hospitals in South Africa. Hospitals in 20th century general hospitals form part of this period's curative approach to healthcare. In admitting the sick, public health can be maintained by ensuring that diseases are identified, affected patients provided appropriate treatment, and once cured, that these same individuals can be released as fully functioning and productive citizens. In South Africa, this was arguably much of the motivation for the biomedical care of Black workers on the mines, in factories, and in white homes. While it made economic and administrative sense to condense care into a single structure that catered to a variety of patients and needs, being cost-effective and efficient could at times come into direct conflict with segregationist desires. Indeed, during the majority of the 19th century, medical institutions in Cape Town had an ambiguous relationship with different kinds of patients. Practices of separation followed lines of class, gender, and religion, as well as diagnosis, with priorities shifting according to financial constraints and patient complaints. While race featured in the decision-making process, the allocation of patients towards within existing structures was fluid and changeable until the 1890s, when strict separation was often architecturally enforced in the building of separate structures for different racial groups. Although this differentiation was to dominate the logic of South African hospital design in the 20th century, competing architectural plans for general hospitals published in the South African Architectural Record testify to the ongoing flexibility of segregationist principles in the decades leading up to apartheid. One such published competition, noted by the editors to be the first of its kind, focused on the plan for a hospital in Roodepoort, a town just outside the city of Johannesburg. Here, as in many other hospitals in South Africa at the time, wards were to be confined to two separate buildings. with Black patients of color allocated to a freestanding native hospital, that's what they were called, and white patients allocated to the main structure. Despite this explicit segregation along lines of race, the shared grounds and joint facilities, including the kitchen, administrative area, and operating theatre, provided ample opportunity for overlap. Two of the most penetrative rituals of the hospital, the making of food and surgical incision, were to touch common ground. Yet this proximity across the racial divide went largely unremarked in discussions of the proposed designs. Instead, feedback to various possible layouts for the hospital took explicit issue with the crossing of sight lines. Repeatedly, critique is levied against plans that would see the European wards look onto, overlook, or face the native hospital. While Roodepoort Hospital was to house patients of different racial groups in different structures, other segregationist measures were used in other parts of the country. In 1932, a case of a proposed hospital catering to non-Europeans in Durban, a coastal city in the northeastern part of the country, demonstrates how race-based divisions appear to have been implemented in accordance with regional perceptions and priorities. In Durban, the umbrella term of non-European would have been attributed to any person of color in this region, particularly those categorized as Indian of South Asian descent or native, Black African. While these two population groups were considered to be inherently different by contemporary commentators, both were nonetheless to be housed under a single roof. As the so-called non-starter stated in response to the competing architectural plans for this building, quote, "There are plenty of difficulties and snags where the institution is intended for only one class of patient, but where, as in the case of this hospital, it is intended for inmates of widely different natures and habits, natives and Indians chiefly, the difficulties are vastly added to. The native and the Indian will not mix under any circumstances. Segregation of the races, therefore, must be a sine qua non. Rather than creating entirely separate structures, it is the floor plan that was called upon to separate supposedly incompatible groups of people." While not explicitly said, the willingness to see members of two racial groups housed under the same clinical roof in Durban, while European and natives had to share hospital facilities in Roodepoort, was likely the result of financial constraints. For the Durban hospital, a single large building would have been less costly to construct than two smaller duplicates, while for both hospitals, the doubling up of clinical, radiographic, as well as culinary equipment would have been expensive and impractical. However, though financial constraints offer some justification for the diverging plans, these designs also appear to have varied in keeping with the relative difference perceived between Europeans and non-Europeans in South Africa at the time. While white patients required visual and spatial safeguarding from Black patients in Roodepoort, in Durban, the same degree of difference was not recognized between patients who fell under the heterogeneous banner of non-European. This varied regulation of space is thus indicative of degrees of difference and thresholds of proximity between racial groups in the 1930s. Borders could and would shift in keeping with regional requirements. It is precisely this flexibility of spatial regulation and relative perception of racial difference that appears to have surfaced in the planning and construction of Cape Town's Grootskio Hospital. Originally drawn up in 1920 by Colonel D.J. McIntosh, the superintendent of Glasgow's Western Infirmary. The plans for the hospital had been inspired by 19th century pavilion designs that privileged fresh air and sunlight. Within a decade, however, this model was to undergo redrawing by Francis David Strong of South Africa's Public Works Department, notably after the departmental head had visited contemporary hospitals overseas. The resulting design was a 6-storied block building based on 1920s hospitals of England and America. So modern was this new design that the South African architectural record boasted in 1932 that, quote, "When the hospital is completed, it will be one of the most up-to-date hospitals in the world," end quote. Despite such praise, however, the building's ultimate opening 6 years later quickly revealed it to be clinically outdated as well as administratively cumbersome. It was, however, ideologically current. During the first half of the 20th century, Cape Town was demographically divided into almost equal parts of European and so-named Cape Coloured citizens, a racial group that incorporated those of mixed ancestry, as well as indigenous communities, including the Khoikhoi and the San. Treating Black Africans as statistically negligible, public health reports and medical publications in Cape Town took the coloured rather than Black subject as a particular point of interest and anxiety. While the 1920s had seen official segregation of Black people with the passing of policies to regulate travel, land ownership, work, and even sex, coloured Cape Townians remained politically ambiguous. Although located as less than European, the category of Cape Coloured was deemed not quite Black enough for the kind of spatial demarcation the city had witnessed at the turn of the century. It is the uncertain relationship between white and coloured as racial categories that appears to have been materially uttered in the design of Hamidiah Hospital. Unlike the Roodepoort Hospital, a separation of the races did not necessitate separate buildings. With its design finalized in 1929, the hospital was, to quote Professor Yanni Lowe, quote, symmetrically and equally divided into white and non-white sections with identical accommodation and services, end quote. All patients were housed under the same roof, not unlike private and charitable cases in the Western world, or Indians and natives in Durban. Indeed, the design even followed contemporary attitudes towards small and thus necessarily shared hospitals in the American South, whose layout required, quote, the efficient handling of various types of traffic without the interfering, crossing, or conflicting one with another, end quote. At Cape Town Hospital, separate entrances were designed to ensure that racially distinct casualty patients and publics entered, lingered, or were surgically treated with minimal optical or spatial interaction. Although proximate enough to share the same hospital, the notion that the non-European patient remained a social and medical risk of some kind is evident even in the material culture of the old Grooteskuur. As Anne Digby's research has unearthed, not only records but crockery and blankets were color-coded according to race, conflating cross-racial contact with matter out of place. The hospital building itself thus needed to facilitate visual and tactile separation. Space could be shared, but only as long as eyes did not cross and bodies did not touch, at least not without the mediation of white nurses, surgeons, students. Cross-contamination was thus prevented in more than a bacteriological sense. But at Grooteskuur, differential treatment was not reserved for patients and visitors. From 1943, Indian and coloured medical students were granted piecemeal access to Cape Town's medical school and its teaching hospitals, including the old Grooteskuur. Yet while facilities and training were tentatively open, these individuals were not allowed to examine patients from the European wards. Indeed, students of colour were not even permitted to look at the corpse of a white person. They were required to wait outside the mortuary until organs were removed for disembodied inspection. Not only space, but also sight were thus regulated to ensure that clinicians of colour could not wield any form of institutional authority against the white body, whether living or dead. Historians of hospitals in Southern Africa have gone to great pains to highlight that formal modes of segregation were not only incomplete, but often impossible to implement due to the necessary sharing of expensive facilities, the reliance on Black and coloured labour, and the liberal attitudes of some medical staff. While imperfect, architectural divisions at the old Grooteskuur Hospital nonetheless not only communicated, but fundamentally reinforced race-based divisions that were only to find legislative hold after 1948. Carol Duncan highlights that state-sanctioned buildings publicly represent beliefs about the order of the world, its past and present, and the individual's place within it, end quote. Unlike the spectacular sacraments of the temple or church, it is the unassuming rituals that take shape in these spaces that require acknowledgement. This is because ritual practices do not necessarily remain within the confines of the spaces in which they are structured. As Tony Bennett argues, the internal logic of state buildings can lead to de-institutionalizing the kinds of vision and ordering practices that occur behind their walls. Calling it the exhibitionary complex, Bennett identifies a crucial aspect of institutional space, namely that the hierarchies enacted within can be carried beyond its borders. Before even setting foot into the old Huwa Hospital, the building's allegiance was communicated by its facade. The combination of neoclassical markers, Corinthian columns, medical and regional symbolism, Hygeia, the goddess of health, and Zimbabwean eagles representing Cecil John Rhodes, as well as romantic flair of cherubs, urns, and regional flora, blend the visual language state with the healing power of clinical care, a meeting of domestic, colonial, ancient, and modern traditions. Entering the space meant stepping into a place of authority, a place of ceremony, and a place of healing transformation that was proudly local, a product of not only the South African state, but the city of Cape Town. European and non-European patients were proximate enough to share a roof, but they, like the hospital's interior, were to remain divided. In the history of hospital design, it is well known that medical buildings have agency, that their architecture, quote, served explicitly as an active physical agent in treatment, end quote, and with interiors long recognized to affect the length of convalescence. The space of the hospital is thus lived as well as it is legible. Its power cannot only be seen, but also felt. Rather than passive or dead things, historical clinical structures may thus be understood to affect the people they house and the landscapes they inhabit. As Michalina Sembilas offers, the potency of racism similarly lies in its experiential form, not in what race and racism are, but what race and racism do to those subject to their force. Despite being decommissioned as a clinical facility in 1987, the old Huwa Hospital continues to be harnessed for medical administration and lectures. Lingering on the borders of its relatively new, racially integrated replacement, the old structure remains a fundamental part of Cape Town's medical school and its urban landscape. If we are to take the hospital as a space of unspectacular secular ceremonies, to use Duncan's phrase, then attention must be paid to the cues that historically prompted particular attitudes both within and without its walls. So just to conclude, to think about how buildings such as the old Huwa Hospital operate now is to necessarily treat them as affective remnants that, quote, bring the past into the present. Designed first in 1920, its plans redrawn and finalized in 1929, its construction initiated in 1933, and its doors opened in 1938, this multiracial but segregated space forged ahead of apartheid policies that would only a decade later impact the majority of Cape Town's inhabitants. Thus, while practices within South African hospitals might be up for debate, the material makeup thereof remains literally set in stone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Thank you for your presentation, fascinating. And thank you also for not exceeding the time. I think it links perfectly with issues that have been discussed throughout these days and also with other conferences of the International Network. A few years ago, this topic of the integration and segregation was exposed. So thank you very much. We'll discuss later. And now, please, Antonio Coelho Rodriguez, try your presentation. Well, Antonio he's carried out the second intervention. He comes from the Universidad Privada del Norte in Peru with the paper Lima Hospital Uses, Functions and Changes During the Viceroyalty. Antonio will make his presentation in Spanish, so the title will be Hospitales Limeños, Usos, Funciones y Cambios durante el Virreinato. He has studied archaeology and history at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, Peru. For this reason, among his scientific production, we find publications related to these two disciplines. And regarding this conference, topics like health, hygiene, and hospitals in the colonial Peru. Antonio, si eres tan amable.
Gracias. Gracias. Buenos días con todos.
Buenos días.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días acá en Perú. Buenas tardes en las Europas. Bueno, este trabajo es una investigación que estoy realizando sobre los hospitales. Yo hablo en castellano y el texto abajo está en inglés, por si acaso. Este es el plano de Lima. Lima se funda en 1535. Pueden ver en amarillo, en yellow, la ubicación de la Plaza Mayor, y en rojo o red, la zona de los hospitales. Lima construyó sus 3 hospitales desde el siglo XVI. Una vez que se fundó Lima, inmediatamente construyó hospitales en esta zona. ¿Por qué los puso en esta zona? Porque Lima pensaban en esa época, durante la colonia, que los vientos soplaban hacia el este, y al estar ubicados los hospitales en esta zona, van a irse todas las enfermedades hacia la sierra. Los 3 hospitales eran San Andrés, Santa Ana y San Bartolomé. San Andrés era para atender a la población blanca o española. Santa Ana era para los indígenas y San Bartolomé era para los esclavos. Es decir, cada hospital era para cada casta o cada raza. Aquí están los planos de los 3 hospitales coloniales que existen. El único hospital que no funciona hasta ahorita es el de Santa Ana, ¿no? San Andrés y San Bartolomé. Estos 3 hospitales se caracterizaban por que cada uno tenía un patio o claustro, está acá, un patio o claustro, tenía una capilla o iglesia, tenía también su huerta o chacra, su cementerio y las salas de enfermos. Las salas de enfermos se llamaban crujías, ¿no? Pueden ver allí los 3 planos de los 3 hospitales que están semejantes, de manera semejante. Este es el hospital de San Andrés. Hasta ahora existe en la ciudad de Lima, pero está abandonado. Está declarado inhabitable. Es un sitio vacío. Lo tiene la Municipalidad de Lima. Fue fundado aproximadamente en 1552 por el virrey Hurtado de Mendoza. Este era específicamente para la atención de la población blanca. Allí pueden ver el claustro principal con sus arcos, y esta es la famosa capilla de San Andrés. Allí tienen una cita textual de cómo era el hospital de San Andrés, ¿no? Se decía que este tenía 500 camas y había un servicio de esclavos. Tenía farmacia, al igual que cada uno de estos hospitales. Tenía su panadería, su lavandería. Es decir, todos estos hospitales tenían estos patrones. Aquí. ¿Sí? Aquí pueden ver las salas del hospital. Este es el hospital hoy en día, como le dije, está abandonado. Y estas llamadas eran las llamadas crujías. Las crujías eran salas largas, de forma rectangular u oblonga, donde el paciente ingresaba por los pies, es decir, por acá, y poco a poco, conforme se agravaba su situación o se iba enfermando, iba yendo hacia adelante. Aquí en esta imagen lo pueden ver. Este es un grabado, una pintura del siglo XVII. Aquí están. Estas habitaciones vienen a representar esto. Ahí es donde el muerto pasaba el enfermo pasaba sus últimos días. Debemos decir también que la gente pobre es la que acudía al hospital. La gente rica se trataba en sus casas. Entonces acá por lo general iba la gente muy, muy pobre. Y ahí brindaba sus servicios, ahí hacía sus necesidades. El hospital les daba alimentos. A cada uno le daba sus alimentos, ¿no? Era sopa, guisos y un pan dulce o una galleta de agua, y siempre acompañado de una copa de vino. Eso está publicado en todos los documentos y manuscritos que están en los diversos archivos de Lima, ¿no? El Hospital de San Andrés fue excavado por nosotros y pudimos encontrar un montón de evidencias. Por ejemplo, esta foto es de la zona del cementerio. El Hospital de San Andrés, a lo largo de 300 años, ha tenido diversos usos. Ha sido hospital, ha sido parte de la Facultad de Medicina de San Marcos, que es la primera facultad de acá de América. Y en este hospital, como dije, encontramos varios entierros. Entonces, ahí pueden notar en la foto, excavación y los entierros, ¿no? Entierro 1, 2, 3, 4. Entonces, nosotros excavamos y eso está publicado. En Estados Unidos lo publicamos. Asociado a los entierros también pudimos encontrar todo el menaje, la cerámica, también material quirúrgico del siglo XIX se encontró. Y en cuanto a la dieta, pudimos encontrar restos de caballos, de mula, aves de corral. La cerámica también había cerámica inca o cerámica nativa y cerámica vidriada, que era la española. Entonces, todos estos hospitales, cada uno tenía su cementerio. Este es el Hospital de San Bartolomé. Tal como San Andrés fue hospital de blancos, San Bartolomé era un hospital específicamente para los esclavos, o los afroperuanos, o la población negra, ¿no? Este hospital, ¿cómo surge? Los amos y la gente potentada y los hacendados que tenían sus esclavos, que eran utilizados como mano de obra, al llegar a ser viejos, estos esclavos eran abandonados por sus amos. Entonces, estos esclavos deambulaban por la ciudad de Lima, hasta que prontamente la corona española y las órdenes religiosas se dieron cuenta de que había que ayudar a estos personajes, ¿no? Que estaban deambulando y se morían en las calles, según los datos de archivos que encontramos. Los esclavos se morían por las calles. Entonces se funda este hospital. Este hospital recibía a todos los esclavos con enfermedades y los curaba. Y vivían allí sus últimos días. Pero también los hacendados y la gente de mucho poder económico que tenía algún esclavo que estaba enfermo, lo llevaba acá al sitio y en este sitio se le curaba, se le trataba hasta que esté bien. Una vez que estaba bien, venía el dueño del esclavo y pagaba por él y después se retiraba. Este hospital en el año 1830 va a ser convertido en un hospital para soldados. Es el primer hospital militar que va a haber en el Perú. Hoy en día, al igual que San Andrés, este hospital también está abandonado. De todo este recinto, solamente existe una sala que es utilizada para enfermedades sexuales. Lo demás del hospital, tal como pueden ver en la foto actual, que dice Today View, está abandonado y está convertido en un depósito administrativo, ¿no? Ahí pueden ver los papeles, cajas, todo esto está completamente abandonado. Y además debemos decir y recalcar que este hospital, al igual que los otros que han estado viendo y que van a ver, están en el centro histórico de Lima. El centro histórico de Lima está súper poblado, está muy deteriorado. Entonces, esta zona es una zona muy, muy, muy fea y muy peligrosa. Entonces, ahí tenemos ese problema, ¿no? Que estos hospitales están en esta lucha, si destruirlos y construir nuevos hospitales para darles salud al pueblo o mantenerlos como patrimonio. Debemos decir que San Andrés nomás está considerado como patrimonio de la humanidad. San Bartolomé no está y Santana, que lo van a ver a continuación, ya no existe. Esta es la vista exterior del hospital de San Bartolomé. Pueden ver, aquí está, la edificación del siglo XVII, está ahí en pie. Y como les dije, es una zona muy, muy fea, es muy peligrosa. Esta es la capilla que aún existe del Hospital de San Bartolomé. Todos los hospitales tenían su capilla y su cementerio, tal como les dije al inicio. Esta zona hay una sala nomás, ¿no? Para enfermos. Este es el otro hospital, el Hospital de Santana. Fue hecho específicamente para la población indígena. Este era el hospital más grande. Aquí está Santana. Atrás de la iglesia estaba el hospital de San Bartolomé y al otro lado estaba el hospital de San Andrés. Como les dije, los tres hospitales estaban juntos. Y en 1808 también se va a fundar la Escuela de Medicina. La misma ya existía, pero era como un programa muy incipiente. Pero en 1808, con las reformas borbónicas, se funda la Escuela de Medicina. Así que la Escuela de Medicina estaba al costado de San Andrés y los estudiantes salían, cruzaban la plaza para ir a atender al Hospital de Santa Ana, a San Bartolomé y a cualquiera de estos 3 hospitales, ¿no? Entonces, este es el primer hospital que les dije, de Lima. Él va a seguir existiendo a lo largo de toda la vida republicana. Pero durante también los primeros años de la República, en 1830, 1840, este hospital ya era deficiente, mostraba muchas debilidades. El hospital estaba saturado porque fue hecho en una ciudad sin características médicas, no tenía un sistema higiénico. Todo esto va a cambiar con las reformas borbónicas. Entonces, este hospital va a seguir existiendo y recién en 1920 va a ser modificado y destruido, ¿no? Se hacen diversas modificaciones, pero ya en la década de 1920 se decide destruirlo porque ya no se soportaba. Según los datos de archivos y los periódicos de la época, dicen que este hospital, aparte de ser tan grande, estaba saturado, estaba completamente, era un foco de infección. En este hospital pasaban todas las cosas y cada cierto tiempo que aparecía alguna pandemia, alguna enfermedad, este hospital se saturaba. Y tal como ustedes han visto en las salas, en las crujías, los enfermos primero se ponían en camas, pero cuando ya estaba completamente lleno, los enfermos se iban a dormir al suelo, sobre una manta, sobre un colchón, ¿no? Cada hospital, como les dije también, tenía su farmacia. Estas farmacias eran atendidas por boticarios que habían aprendido el oficio de padres a hijos. Pero recién en el siglo XIX, exactamente en 1856, van a llegar al Perú las hermanas de la Caridad de San Vicente de Paúl. Estas hermanas francesas ya tenían conocimiento sobre la atención de enfermos y la producción de medicina para México y Chile, que fueron los primeros países de América. Es así que llegan al Perú y ellas se van a hacer cargo del cuidado de los enfermos y de la atención de la botica. Pero a la vez también para 1856 ya la Escuela de Medicina se va a convertir en una facultad, es decir, se institucionaliza y el Estado va a proteger a la Escuela de Medicina. Entonces comienza una pugna entre el conocimiento científico de los médicos contra el conocimiento caritativo, que está representado por las Hermanas de la Caridad. Y además, en 1821, una vez que el Perú es libre, aparece la beneficencia pública, que es una tradición hispana, y la Sociedad de Beneficencia Pública se encargaba de atender los hospitales, y ellos vivían de la caridad, ¿no? Aquí podemos ver exactamente lo que era una sala de enfermos llamada crujía. Este es un término, es una voz arcaica, una voz antigua, ¿no? Pueden ver la crujía con los pacientes. Entonces, en el centro de cada crujía, porque eran varias salas que estaban comunicadas, en el centro de cada sala existía un altar, donde se ponía una cruz o un santo, ¿no? Alguna entidad santa. Entonces los enfermos, una vez que se iban agravando, como les dije al iniciar esto, conforme se iban poniendo más grave, iban cambiando de cama y al llegar el momento ya de morir, morían, de acuerdo a esa época, en gracia divina, es decir, cerca al altar. Pues acá pueden ver esta foto, que es de 1903. Y esta es una foto del hospital de Santa Ana. También pueden ver la misma característica, ¿no? Todos son hospitales claustro con estos arcos. En estas crujías, cada enfermo hacía sus necesidades. Nosotros también pudimos excavar dentro de las crujías y encontramos todos los restos de alimento, todas las cosas que habían botado, el menaje, todos sus utensilios que una vez que se rompían la losa, se quedaba ahí y ahí se limpiaba todo, ¿no? Este es el último hospital. Más que un hospital, tal como dice ahí su nombre, era un hospital hospicio. Era el hospital o hospicio de incurables. Este hospital, ¿qué tiene de raro? Durante la época de la colonia, el virreinato, en este hospital la gente pobre acudía aquí y ahí podía dormir y pasar sus días y ir a comer, a almorzar. Entonces, más que un hospital, era un hospicio, por eso dice hospicio, hospital de incurables. Aparte que el nombre de por sí es horrible, ¿no? Este nombre de incurables te dice todo. Este hospital hasta el día de hoy existe, está pegado al río también, está en una zona muy, muy pobre dentro del centro histórico de Lima. Y aquí pueden ver también nuevamente la crujía o sala de enfermos. Esta crujía es del siglo XVI y pueden ver cómo la sala originalmente ha sido convertida ahora en habitaciones para los pacientes, ¿no? Está separado por tabiques o por tripley, por madera, para atender a cada paciente. Dentro de este hospital también hay capilla, había un cementerio, carnicería, panadería, lavandería, y como tenían el río al costado, ahí mismo podían lavar sus cosas. Actualmente este hospital es un hospital para ciencias neurológicas, y el pobre hospital también está saturado y completamente ya declarado inhabitable, pero aún así existe en funcionamiento. Esta es la capilla del Hospital de Incurables. Esta es la foto antigua de 1913. Y aquí pueden ver a una monja de la Hermana de la Caridad de San Vicente Paúl y lo que es hoy en día. De todos los hospitales que he dicho, San Andrés está declarado inhabitable, pero aún existe. San Bartolomé también existe y solamente atiende una sala para enfermedades sexuales, de transmisión sexual. Este Hospital de Incurables también existe, pero la capilla, tal como pueden ver, que en el lado izquierdo es neogótica, dio paso a esta fusión, a esta cosa tan horrible de capilla, ¿no? Una cosa tan fea de hospital. Este hospital recientemente ha sido declarado patrimonio, y aquí atienden también a pacientes muy, muy pobres. Y para que se ubiquen, si los que conocen Lima, este es el Cerro San Cristóbal, que es el cerro que domina la ciudad de Lima, ¿no? Ahora sí, la última. ¿Estoy bien, no, Raúl, con el tiempo?
Sí, adelante, sí. Concluye tranquilamente, no hay prisa.
Ya. Conclusiones, voy a ir hablándoles en castellano para que ustedes lean en inglés. Los hospitales coloniales siempre se mantuvieron gracias a donaciones. Los virreyes, las órdenes sacerdotales se hacían cargo y mucha gente pudiente de Lima entregaba grandes dotes, ¿no? O daba sus casas, y esas casas se vendían, y después con esa casa vendida se atendía a los pacientes, ¿no? Cada hospital de Lima fue específicamente para atender a razas, ¿no? Tal como le dije, los blancos, San Andrés, los africanos para San Bartolomé y los indios para Santa Ana. Aparte existieron una categoría de hospitales muy pequeñitos, pero eran específicamente ya para profesiones. Los marineros tenían un hospital. Las niñas blancas españolas, muy pudientes, de mucha plata, tenían el Hospital de la Caridad, pero eran como una posta médica, como un consultorio privado. Entonces, por eso no los he puesto. Y de esos hospitales ya no existen. Las pruebas solamente tenemos de los que yo les he mostrado, ¿no? Entonces, estos hospitales vivían de la caridad, ¿no? No había un tratamiento médico ni quirúrgico para atender a los pacientes. Los pacientes llegaban a morir en manos de Dios. Era la buena muerte. La gente pudiente se moría en sus casas. Incluso hay textos, por ejemplo, hay un texto que se llama Plan Dieta Alimentaria del Hospital San Juan de Dios, escrito en 1780. Entonces, ahí en este libro se menciona el tratamiento que se debía dar, y más que todo es el tratamiento en base a oraciones, rezos, confesiones diarias, comuniones diarias y sacrificios. Eso es lo que imperaba. Recordemos que la medicina no existe en esta época, y si existe está supeditada a la religión. Recién la religión va a dar paso a la ciencia con las reformas borbónicas, 1780, 1770. En el siglo XVIII, cuando llegan las reformas borbónicas, modifican todo esto, modifica todo el pensamiento de Lima. Lima va a sufrir muchos cambios. Se construye, por ejemplo, el primer cementerio, porque antes los muertos se enterraban en las iglesias, en los conventos. La gente pudiente se enterraba en bóvedas sepulcrales, las llamadas catacumbas, ¿no? El cementerio aparece en Lima. Hay un excelente trabajo sobre el cementerio y la historia escrito por Gabriel Ramón, que ustedes lo pueden consultar. en la web, ¿no? Entonces, todo esto va a modificar el patrón. Lima se va a higienizar gracias a estas ideas borbónicas, ¿no? Estas ideas higienistas. En cuanto a la característica de estos 3 hospitales que hemos mencionado y todos los hospitales coloniales, tenían el denominado concepto del hospital claustro. Ya les he explicado por qué, porque era un claustro con arcos, con barandas, con balaustres, como quieran llamarlo, mientras que esto va a desaparecer en el siglo XIX y van a aparecer el hospital pabellón. Aquí lo pueden ver, el hospital pabellón. Y recién en 1875 el Perú va a construir un hospital. Imagínense, desde 1535 recién vamos a construir un hospital durante la República, que es el famoso Hospital 2 de Mayo, que es el ejemplo del hospital pabellón. Y este hospital hasta ahora existe también en el centro de Lima y también lastimosamente está saturado, está completamente deteriorado y ahora más con la pandemia ha colapsado este hospital, entonces ya no se da abasto, pero ese sí está declarado patrimonio, entonces la misma pugna, ¿no? O destruirlo o hacer algo nuevo, entonces ese hay un problema siempre. Bueno, los hospitales van a seguir funcionando, tal como dice acá. El único hospital que ya no existe es el de Santa Ana, ¿no? Ese sí fue destruido en 1920, están declarados ahora Patrimonio de la Nación. Y todos estos hospitales, y al igual que la salud, que era en base a la caridad, va a sufrir una modificación, pues en 1821, cuando el Perú ya es libre, aparece la Sociedad de Beneficencia. Esta Sociedad de Beneficencia de Lima era un ente caritativo y representado por las familias burguesas. Eran familias pudientes y de rancia aristocracia, ¿no? Eran familias muy nobles, y ellos daban óbolos, daban caridades, daban donativos para mantener. Entonces, el año que era malo, los hospitales estaban mal, pero el año que era muy bueno para esta gente de la Sociedad de Beneficencia era un año muy bueno, entonces los enfermos tenían mejor tratamiento, tenían mejor alimentación. Por ejemplo, en la historia peruana, desde 1821, 30, 1840, 1850, va a ser una época de caos, continuamente caos, pugnas, peleas, rivalidades. Y recién en 1856 el Perú se estabiliza con la llamada falaz prosperidad, ¿no? Que es la época del guano, cuando el Perú descubre la riqueza del guano y en base al guano se hace rico y empieza a construir obras. Y la sociedad de beneficencia se beneficia de todo esto y empieza a tener buenos hospitales y buena salud. Esa es rápidamente una breve historia de los hospitales y cómo han ido sufriendo modificaciones durante el devenir de la historia peruana. Bueno, espero que haya sido de su agrado y estoy atento a sus preguntas y comentarios. Gracias.
Pues muy bien, Antonio, muchas gracias por cumplir con el tiempo y por el esfuerzo y por el resumen. Y la verdad que es una pena, ¿no? que esos edificios se encuentren en tan lamentable estado. Bueno, luego continuaremos. And finally, the third presentation, we have Lin Jisai. Lin Jisai, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Here.
Okay, she's from the National Jianmin University. She's a physician of traditional Chinese medicine, graduated from the Institute of Science, Technology and Society in that university in Taiwan. Her presentation is Taiwanese hospitals, plague quarantine hospitals using hand medicine in early colonial Taiwan. And this paper is connected with her master's dissertations. Probably in this session, this is the paper more connected with our current situation, this pandemic. Please, Lin Jisai, you have 20 minutes.
Okay.
Try your presentation.
Sure. So can everyone hear me perfect?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Lin Jisai from Taiwan, and thanks for Chair's introduction. I graduated from STS Institute Today, I'm going to present a part of my master's thesis. The title is The Inception of Modern Taiwanese Han Medicine. The subtitle is as follows. The Han medicine refers to Han people. Han medicine in Mandarin, Han Yi, largely used to call the traditional medicine or traditional medical doctors by Taiwanese in Japanese colonial era. In this paper, I will compare Hong Kong and Taiwan in terms of plague control and hospitals. My research topic, Taiwanese hospitals, is relatively a special institute. They were basically plague quarantine hospitals using Han medicine in early colonial Taiwan. In the picture is Huang Hwa, a well-known Han medical doctor, launching several social movements such as anti-food binding and bread cutting movement. He is also regarded as a representative of civilization in Taiwan. First, I want to introduce Taiwanese Han medical doctors. They are well-literate and mostly educated people in Taiwan. According to statistics in 1897, there were more than 1,000 Han medical doctors, while only 24 Western medical doctors. That refers to missionary physicians mostly. So the Han medical doctors are in majority. I'm personally a Chinese medical doctor, so I want to know more about the history of Taiwanese traditional medicine. I start to study the topic of Han medical doctors treating plague because of the Dr. Huang Hwa, as in the previous picture, and his book, this book, 各大瘟治法新编, the new edition of bubonic plague therapeutic methods. Very lucky I got a copy of the book, but I'm not going to go deep for this medical text. I started to form my question on how Han medical doctors got involved in the plague control policy. I actually started my research before the COVID-19 pandemic about 5 years ago. At that time, pandemic is not a very sexy research topic, but little do I know the pandemic would happen. We're all in the pandemic now. In the past studies, In the past studies, I found Taiwanese Han medical doctors did participate in plague control, but we know little about how. Is it similar to the Ming and Qing dynasty? There was a tradition of dispensing herbal medicine when facing epidemics by traditional medical doctors, the local government, or by wealthy families as charity. We all know that in Japan, during Meiji Restoration, Japanese were eager to learn from the West. Therefore, for their first colony, Taiwan, they want to use science and statistics to govern. Why Japanese government allow Taiwanese Han medical doctors to get involved in plague control? Shouldn't they simply force Taiwanese to accept Western medicine? A common explanation is that there were not enough numbers of Western medical doctors. So the colonial government need to get help from the local Han medical doctors. But is it really the case? Before I jump into the Taiwanese hospitals, I would like to talk about Hong Kong. There is a famous Chinese hospital established in the 19th century. Huang Hwa Hospital is also a hospital using Chinese medicine, just like Taiwanese hospital using Han medicine, which is also traditional medicine. To better understand Taiwan, I would like to compare Taiwan and Hong Kong over the issue of governmental plague control policy and hospitals in the time of plague. Huang Hwa Hospital was originally an ancestral hall where the funeral took place, and later built into a Chinese hospital due to its poor sanitary conditions being revealed. So basically, it was like dead people, the end-stage patients going there. And later, it turned into Chinese hospital. The medical service in Donghua was highly autonomic at that time. The Donghua County comprising mostly wealthy businessmen. They are educated people and gradually recognized by the British colonial government. Both the hospital service and the county was recognized by the Chinese people. The county gradually became a bridge to connect Chinese general public and the British officials. There were 3 to 8 medical doctors in the hospital. Since the experience would bring the doctor fame and fortune, the job was highly competitive amongst Chinese medical doctors. They need to write medical essay and receive peer review. There were both inpatient and outpatient departments, but surgery and forensic autopsy were rare. Now, I'd like to talk about the 1984 plague in Hong Kong. The epidemic spread from Canton to Hong Kong in May. Because the director of civil hospital found 20 cases in Donghua, he believed the Chinese medical doctors were not able to treat the plague. All plague patients were moved to the hospital ship Hamidiah. After the outbreak, the government started house-to-house visits, thorough cleaning, and a bunch of sanitary measures. The deaths must be buried in the plague cemetery. The ill must move to quarantine hospitals. The troops disinfect patients' houses and all their belongings, sometimes, if necessary, burnt. As you can see in the picture, there's smoke coming out from the pile. Here is another picture, show how furniture were removed and burnt. Here is a coffin in the middle. The government demanded to disinfect the dead body with quicklime, and that stirred the Chinese people's emotion. The Chinese thought it is very disrespectful to the dead. This is the picture of the plague cemetery now. We can see the gravestones with names and numbers on it, like over here. This cemetery located 300 yards west to the Kennedy Town Hospital. Kennedy Town Hospital is the major quarantine hospital during the epidemic. There were some more quarantine hospitals, for example, Glasswork Hospital, Slaughterhouse Hospital, and the last one, like Ji Gok Hospital. There were Chinese medical doctors in Glasswork under Western medical doctors' supervision. It is better to have Chinese medical doctors than nothing. So the Chinese leaders asked the government to remove patients from Hamidiah to the Glasswork, even though the environment was not very good, as we can see from the picture. In 23rd June, Lai Ji Gok Hospital opened in Canton. Chinese plague patients scrambled to the hospital because there they provide Chinese medical treatment and no Western doctors. Of course, the colonial government was not happy about this, so the hospital then soon closed. After the outbreak, the government believed the Chinese medical doctors were not capable of diagnosing and treating the plague patients. They settled Western medical doctors to make the preliminary diagnosis and then arrange patients to receive treatment, Chinese medicine or Western medicine. So logically reasoning, if there is a suspected patient going to Donghua, chances are that he will be sent to quarantine hospital first. Although Donghua Hospital is the Chinese hospital, their Chinese medical doctors couldn't exert their professional abilities. As for how Chinese medical doctors work in the Glasswork Hospital, I'm not very sure since I don't have related documents also. This is the plan for Huang Hwa Hospital, established in 1911. Huang Hwa is a member of the Donghua group. So I believe the setting was pretty much the same. You can see here is a register room at the front gate. Now I'm going to talk about the plague in Taiwan and the related medical institutes. Japan acquired Taiwan after the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and Japan colonial government initiated civil administration the next year. In the same year, the plague outbreak in Taiwan, first in Tainan and later in Taipei. The epidemic went on from 1896 to 1917 in Taiwan, so it's a pretty long period of time. The plague policies were pretty much the same as Hong Kong British government. Japanese colonial government started to do household survey with the help of policemen, military police, and the doctors. Also, there is sanitary measures using carbolic acid, quicklime, and lime water largely. Plague patients will be sent to quarantine hospitals or set up a home quarantine room if there is no hospital nearby. There is also plague cemetery that allow Taiwanese not to use cremation for the plague death. Since Taiwan is much bigger than Hong Kong, lockdown infected area is necessary, but it brought adverse effect that many people hide from the police and secretly bury the dead bodies. Because Taiwanese people fear the Western quarantine hospitals, many believe it is a death house. So local people started to petition for Taiwanese hospitals, asking the government using home medicine to treat the plague. In the beginning, there were 2 quarantine hospitals open. However, it is the Western hospitals. Taiwanese refused to go there. So in response to the petition, Taiwanese plague clinic set in November in the outskirts of East Gate, Taipei. This is the East Gate now here in Taipei. And this picture is the regulation for the Taiwanese plague clinic. It is set by the Taipei County government. The key of establishment was not only because the petition from the local elites, but from the statistics. There were more Japanese plague patients than Taiwanese, so the government suspect there were massive hidden cases. The Taiwanese plague clinic set to encourage patients to receive traditional medical treatment. TTC opened from 1896 to 99. The superintendent was Japanese Western doctor. There were 2 home medical doctors. One is Huang Hwa from Dadaocheng, Taiwanese Durban. Another is Huang Shouqian from Mengjia, Taiwanese Banga. The Huang Hwa is the first picture I showed before. And this is the map of Taipei in early colonial era. Walls of Taipei surround the city center. Mengjia located in the southwest. Dadaocheng is in the north. Mengjia and Dadaocheng were 2 settlements populated with Taiwanese in general. And in the central, inside the walls of the Taipei, lived mostly Japanese people. 9 buildings comprise the so-called Taiwanese plague clinic. So comparing with the Hong Kong Glasswork Hospital, it is actually a well-organized quarantine hospital complex. TPC is the first official plague quarantine hospital using home medicine, all expenses paid by the government. TPC creates a space for traditional home medicine, working closely with Western medicine. The medical doctors use surgery to remove the bulb if the patient willing to, and home medical doctors prescribe herbal medicine to treat patients. I believe the space is very important and symbolic for the modernization of Taiwanese home medicine. There are some other similar quarantine clinics or hospitals in Taiwan, for example, in Lugang, Tainan, and Zhanghua. These quarantine hospitals might have some sponsorship from government. However, mostly they were fundraised by the local elite. The activity of fundraising for Taiwanese hospitals was popular amongst the wealthy businessmen and families. And here's the map of Taiwan, and the star is the location of other quarantine clinics. And Huang Hwa Public Quarantine Clinic, there was no floor plan for the previous Taipei TPC, but in Huang Hwa there is a plan and also medical records in the document. I'll skip the staffing and special planning here. The Huang Hwa Public Quarantine Clinic looks like this. There are at least 4 wards and 1 intensive care room. And you can see the kitchen in the corner and Han doctor's duty room. Taiwanese elites kept petition and fundraising for building Taiwanese hospitals. Wealthy families were willing to donate and win a good reputation. In Japanese, Yi-in refers to a smaller hospital with less than 20 beds, and Bio-in refers to larger hospitals more than 20 beds. The Taiwanese hospitals are Yi-in, which means they are in smaller scales. At first, the colonial government demanded Western medical doctors to serve as directors, but later, Taiwanese were allowed to be directors. The hospital opened only during the epidemic, not for the year round. I think I need more researchers to find out what the hospitals do during the closed period. Doctors treated only the infectious disease, especially the plague, sometimes cholera. Also, the Han medical doctors would consult Western medical doctors for surgeries. The first Taiwanese hospital is Bao'an Hospital, located in Mongjia. It was a former charity institute. Local health group used the surplus from market and butcher house to support the hospital operation and other health costs. Bao'an opened in 1899, while the official TPC closed in the same year. So the hospital could take over the job of accommodating plague patients. Just quick review again, Mongjia and there are 2 Taiwanese hospitals for each Taiwanese settlement. The floor plan looks like this, and here is the gate and porch and corridor, and there are at least 5 wards. Each ward can accommodate 2 to 3 patients based on its size. And also there's kitchen, because we all know the traditional medicine, you need to cook, so kitchen is necessary. And this is the enlarged view for the ward area. Quickly review the staffing. Huang Tian is the former Han medical doctor in the TPC, and the Han medical doctor, and also he became the doctor for Bao'an. Although there is Western medical doctor serve as superintendent, he's still being recognized as the director for the hospital. And doctors shift for each year, different doctors. And also Huang Yujie shortly served in the Bao'an Hospital. Another hospital is Tian Hospital in Dadaocheng. After several petitions, it opened. And the staff, there's a lot of president and vice president. It's more like Donghua Hospital. They have a director and supervisory board members. Also, there are more Han medical doctors, about 20 in the beginning. The chief director for Han medical doctor is Huang Yujie, and some doctors were his students, like Zhou Yikai, You Ziqiao, and Ye Lianjing listed in the last names. The plan looks like this. There were more spare rooms that could accommodate a large number of patients when facing serious epidemic. Here's the enlarged view. Also, you can see there's kitchen always. and the structure, the two rows looks like the same. So how Western and Han medicine work together, the story usually goes like...
I'm sorry, Lindsay said you should end in 2 minutes, okay? Don't worry, 2 minutes. Don't worry.
The story usually like this. Just like I said previously, the Han medical doctors prescribe and the Western doctor use surgery to remove the lump. And here's another story, just a different Western medical doctor. And there is a full, well-preserved medical record for the Huang Hwa public plague clinic. And let's skip this. And among 54 cured inpatients, and 30 of them received surgery. So here is the conclusion part. For this paper, encountering the peculiar statistic numbers, more Japanese than Taiwanese, the Han medical doctors seized the opportunity to join plague control in the well-regulated space of plague quarantine hospitals. The role of the first official clinic is prominent. Taiwanese Han medical doctors who involved with the plague work were different from those doctors in the Ming and Qing dynasty. They work in the modernized space. They have more chances to see how Western doctors apply surgery. And even they go to larger hospitals to observe big surgeries. And also Chinese doctors were willing to study modern medicine. The two key persons in TPC, Huang Yujie, Huang Shouqian, they initiate Han Medicine Society later. So there's a positive feedback loop that creates good relationship between Chinese Han medical doctors and Japanese Western medical doctors. We cannot take it for granted that colonial government should accept the local medicine. Comparing with Hong Kong, for the British colonial government, they were not really interested to include Chinese medical doctors in the plague control. Of course, it could be beneficial to work with the local doctors, but in terms of epidemic control, the British government insists to intervene Huang Hwa Hospital with more management and the introduction of Western medicine. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for your listening.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And thank you for don't exceed the time. I'm sorry for disturb you. And well, I hope Lindsay said that, as you said, the unpleasant situation of the COVID-19 at least allow you to spread your research to other colleagues and other to society, and we can learn something. Thank you. Well, now before we start with the debate and questions, I just would like to share an idea to motivate everyone's reflection. And I was thinking about if globalization that started in the 16th century onwards was a main element of this segregation and hospital specialization that we see related to race. In the Middle Age, for example, the specialization and the segregation was more related with religion, but not in the two first papers that we have seen. And in the case of the last presentation, we don't see this characteristic not fulfilled, but we also see the relationship between the metropolis and the colony. There's also link and other elements that we should value in our studies. So now we have more or less 15-20 minutes to discuss some questions. Please, everyone who wants to ask something, you have the chat. And I think we have a question in the chat for Antonio. Fritz Ross asked you if, because you said and you wrote that science entered in the Lima hospitals only in the late 18th century. Does that mean that physicians had not been present in Lima hospitals before? Antonio, ¿quieres que traduzca algo? Te preguntan si si la ciencia o la
sí, ya
medicina...
le escribí, gracias.
Nada.
Gracias. Sí, ya le contesté, pero le respondo a todos, ¿no? El conocimiento que va a existir durante la colonia es un conocimiento ligado a la religión, teocrático. Según los documentos históricos que he podido consultar, no existía la ciencia. La ciencia recién llega con las reformas borbónicas, ¿no? La ciencia médica propiamente dicha. La Escuela de Medicina se funda en 1808. Y con las ideas higienistas y las reformas borbónicas aparece la ciencia propiamente dicho. Antes no hay un conocimiento. Llega el conocimiento renacentista, pero recordemos que acá en Lima la Inquisición estaba presente y era muy fuerte, entonces cualquier cosa que iba contra la religión o atentaba contra el designio de Dios, de frente iba a ser observado por la Inquisición. Entonces, sí le contesté. Muchas gracias, Raúl.
Bueno, si me permites, yo creo, a mí me resulta muy extraño lo que planteas, porque al fin y al cabo el modelo español o europeo que se exporta a América o a las colonias, la medicina y la ciencia no es incompatible, yo creo, con la religión, y sabemos que en los hospitales europeos en los siglos XV y XVI había médicos, cirujanos, farmacéuticos, enfermeros y enfermeras. Entonces me resulta muy extraño que hagas ese planteamiento, ¿no? Yo creo que no sé si se conservan ordenanzas o estatutos de hospitales limeños o de hospitales peruanos, pero la información que tengo, por ejemplo, en hospitales mexicanos sí que había médicos, sí que había cirujanos. Otra cosa es que el concepto de ciencia o medicina que nosotros tenemos cambie en el siglo XVIII, ¿no? Con la Ilustración.
Sí, en las constituciones y ordenanzas, ahí está claro el tratamiento. O sea, sí existían médicos que habían venido, incluso la Universidad de San Marcos, que es la decana de América, repartía un título de protomedicato, pero era completamente incipiente, ¿no? Por ejemplo, acá tengo estas constituciones y ordenanzas del Hospital Real de San Andrés, de Santa Ana, perdón, y ahí se menciona el tratamiento, cómo era. Misas todo el día, dar comunión, o sea, estaba supeditado. Quizás se debió dar un tratamiento, pero era muy por lo bajo, ¿no? Para que la Inquisición no esté presente. Y recordemos que todos estos hospitales dependían de órdenes religiosas, entonces por eso te digo, por ejemplo, hay otra autora, Gabriela Ramos, menciona que en los hospitales también se adoctrinaba, más que curar, se adoctrinaba a los indios, en el caso específicamente de Santa Ana. Hay otra hipótesis, ¿no? Diferente. De existir la ciencia existió, pero como te digo, muy, muy bajo, muy, muy incipiente.
Bueno, y has hablado de escuelas médicas que estaban conectadas con estos hospitales, ¿no? Entonces, ¿a partir de qué época están conectadas?
A partir de 1808, la Escuela de Medicina se funda justamente al costado del Hospital de San Andrés. Ahí es que se funda al costado, entonces los médicos salen de sus clases para ir a tratar a los pacientes, pero ya es tardío, es 1808. Es netamente con las reformas borbónicas, el año que se hace el cementerio, el año que se hacen las alamedas, toda la higienización llega recién con las reformas borbónicas. Antes no existía nada de eso. Incluso también los pacientes cuando se morían se enterraban, por eso puse la foto de San Andrés. Hay un cementerio, ellos se enterraban, pero a partir de 1808 se prohíbe que se entierren y que pasen todos a ser enterrados en el cementerio general de Lima.
Muy bien, gracias, Antonio. We have two questions to Michaela Clark in the chat. Joanna Basadapino asked, the hospital buildings that you show us were designed considering segregation of population. The practices of treatment also reveals the same. And if you want, I read you the second question, maybe you can answer. And Ed Devan says, apologies if this has already been asked. I had connection issues in the modern hospital, which serves the same site. I'm wondering if you have looked at ways less formal segregation continues?
Thank you, Raul. Thank you for those questions. So, Joanna, I'm not sure about the two hospital designs other than Grootskeur. I did a lot of the research virtually because of COVID, so I haven't been able to get a lot of access to information related to those two hospitals beyond the kind of published account of the design. But some of the comments that are made, not so much in terms of treatment, but in terms of the building, are very much kind of demonstrate this race-based divide in terms of the care environment. So for instance, a lot of the hospital designs were critiqued because the native hospital was too elaborate, or the furnishings would be too costly. So those were criticisms against some of the designs. Those kinds of critiques were never levied against the main hospital building or the white wards being too elaborate. So you have a bit of a kind of a very obvious division there. More generally, in terms of hospital care in South Africa, there's definitely a difference. In 19th century hospitals, Harriet Deacon has written about this, and a few others, about how the food was different, the kinds of blankets were different. I can't find any evidence of clinical care being different, but definitely the environment and the kind of things around the kind of non-clinical aspects of the hospital were definitely different. Grootskeur, again, really difficult to tell. Again, it's food, it's how much the hospital's willing to spend on each patient is definitely there. A lot of testimony, because the hospital was operating for such a long time before it moved. A lot of oral testimony is more related to kind of subtle moments of racism. So for instance, the way in which colored patients were told to undress, or the haste with which, or the tone with which they were engaged, rather than the actual clinical attention that they received. So I don't have any evidence that the clinical care per se was different, although someone like Randall Packard, who's written about tuberculosis on the mines in the northern part of the country, has argued, or has outlined very, very well how mining medicine in particular kind of fudged the books, and how, for instance, certain kinds of treatment, like they wouldn't diagnose tuberculosis, they'd instead call it something else, because they didn't want anyone to know that there was, a kind of rampant spread of this disease. So there is definitely, across the board, across South Africa as a whole, and Southern Africa more broadly, there is definitely a difference, but it's really hard to pinpoint because a lot of the medical records have been no longer exist, especially 20th century stuff is very, very hard to get hold of. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it did. Then Ed, when you talk about the modern hospital which shares the same site, do you mind just clarifying which hospital you mean in particular? Sorry, I'm just a bit iffy on that. The Grootskeur?
You can connect Ed if you want.
Oh.
You can connect.
Oh, he can't unmute because he's not a co-host.
Okay, right. And at the same time, Antonio, you can now? Yes.
Yeah. Sorry,
yes.
I didn't mean to write that in all caps.
Yeah, you can ask. Yeah.
The modern hospital. I just meant you showed these two buildings on the same site, right? And
the 80s.
We were talking
and
about the
1920s
one, the earlier building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this modern building sharing the same site. You were kind of talking about that at the end. So I was wondering, in this more modern building, how does this history continue in like less formal kinds of segregation?
Right.
in the way patients are treated, or the layout of the wards. I'm not sure. In the oral history, is that something you see?
Right. Thanks so much for that question. I honestly have not extended my research into the 80s, so I'm the wrong person to ask. Anne Digby and Howard Phillips have written a great book about the history of Huang Hospital called At the Heart of Healing that looks a lot at oral histories. It speaks a lot to both patients and nurses and orderlies and doctors who worked there. So that would be an excellent source if you're interested. The one thing about that new building, which was built in, or it kind of shifted from the old to the new in 1987, is that it was overtly a non-segregated hospital. So they built it, there was lots of discussion in the media about it. And also 1987, we're nearing the end of apartheid. We're also in the midst of boycotts, so a lot of pressure on the state, a lot of anti-apartheid sentiment. And so I kind of feel like the framing of the new hospital was very much a kind of, oh, we're moving in the right direction, we're moving away from these segregationist ideas. Of course, we know that there's unconscious bias in medicine, even practiced today. But I don't have, that's not my field at all. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really give you a good answer.
Yeah, related with this, Michaela, I was wondering, because I was searching information about this hospital yesterday and this morning, and in Wikipedia, for example, in English or Spanish, I mean, there's no any kind of this information that you expose. Nobody talks about segregation in Wikipedia. So my question is if this kind of information in the traditional history of the hospital is avoided, because you enter in the webpage and you see just a location, the date of the foundation, the medical services, but you don't find these different services for Black or white people.
I think it's not avoided by the institution, because there was this very big book by Digby and Phillips published in 2008, which was, so the hospital was officially opened in 1938. So this is this, 17 years after. It was this big book, and it was quite critical. So the historians were very critical about the history, were very honest about the events that took place, the kind of segregationist practices. But it is a very thick volume. So it's about, I don't have it here, but it's about this thick. And so what kind of I was interested in is to pull out this particular aspect that I think kind of in the book is isolated to Huang Hospital, but could be extended and looked at in a more broader context. And so to really kind of highlight and pull at those threads. I think I think there is still a lot of discussion about how, doctors were doing their best, and most had very good intentions. And because Cape Town was a more liberal city, that the kind of segregationist practices and the kind of disenfranchisement was not the same as in other more conservative parts of the country. But I'm very tentative to say that is the official. Different people have different arguments. Sorry, I'm just rambling now.
Okay. We have more questions quickly, because we have to end the session in 2 or 3 minutes. For Antonio, John Henderson asked because in the early modern Italy and also in the early modern Spain, the term incurabili or incurable was referred to syphilis patients. So Antonio, this kind of patient were treated in this incurable hospitales incurables or in other hospitals.
Sí, gracias. Justo también ya le respondí sobre la sífilis que existió acá durante la época colonial. Posiblemente se tratarían en su casa. No hay un dato exacto que diga sífilis donde se tratan. Yo creo que sí, que posiblemente fue en el hospital de incurables, porque para la época de la colonia, por ejemplo, tenemos identificadas algunas enfermedades, pero estas enfermedades de transmisión sexual no se dice. Para la República sí, para la República recién va a aparecer un hospital de enfermedades sexuales, pero recién es muy tardío. Durante la época de la colonia pudieron haberse tratado ahí, pero por ejemplo, sí se menciona en fuentes del archivo que el tratamiento que consistía para la sífilis era mercurio. El mercurio se daba para muchas cosas, ¿no? Aquí en el Perú existe un pueblo que se llama Santa Bárbara, donde yo excavé en el 2012, 2013, y es de este sitio que está sobre los 4.500 metros, salía el mercurio que se llevaba hasta Potosí, a las minas de Potosí, y ahí sí hay documentos históricos que se menciona el tratamiento específicamente del mercurio para las enfermedades sexuales. Pero para el caso de Lima no hay un documento, o sea, ampliamos el dato de Huancavelica para llevarlo a Lima.
Muy bien. And I think we are going to finish with a last question that comes from YouTube to Linji Sai. Could you explain more about how hand medicine worked closely with Western medicine in the Taiwanese hospitals? Except that hand medical doctors will consult Western doctors for surgeries?
I believe the number is not very, it's not that much, because you see in the Changhua clinic, there's only 13 people out of 50 something. So Taiwanese people really not so much into accepting the surgery. But if usually in the Taiwanese hospital, the Western medical doctors not always there. I think in my research, I believe it looks like that, because later the Taiwanese hospital run by mostly Taiwanese themselves, and the Western doctors, they come to the hospital just for a visit, just for inspection. So if the hand medical doctor thinks the patient needs the surgical remove, and he might just connect to, maybe ask a messenger to find a medical doctor to do the surgery for the patient. But I believe the number is not many. So I'm not very sure about the details, but it looks like just like a very simple surgery. It's just like a dermatology surgery. You remove the lump just like that, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you, for the three speakers and all the attendees. And we are going to close here this 7th session, because in 15 minutes, more or less, we'll start the next one. Thank you very much. Anna or Joanna, do you have anything to say?
Nope. Enjoy your break. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Fritz Dross. We can start section 8.
Of course.
Please. Okay, thank you.
So, welcome back, everybody. My name is Fritz Dross, and I'm a historian of medicine located in Germany, in southern Germany. And I have the very pleasure to introduce the last session for today, which is titled Hospitals as Social Spaces. I have a sad news to be announced first, which is that Ronja Tripodola had to withdraw her paper due to health reasons, which finally means we will be able to close about half an hour earlier than on the schedule. And I cannot say how sad I am that we will not spend the evening together in lovely Lisbon. It's raining at my place just now, and it's very cold. So I would like to meet you one time. Well, the general rules have not changed. We have 20 minutes per paper. I will raise my hand like this to announce that there are 5 minutes left to the presenters. The discussion will be after we have heard all the 3 presentations for this afternoon. So we are going from Iberia and Spain to the Eastern Mediterranean world, to the late Ottoman Empire, and we will have some reflections of socio-cultural challenges on the hospital and medical spaces in Iran this afternoon session. The first paper is presented by a Spanish-Mexican cooperation. As I can see, it's on spatial dimensions of the Holy Cross Hospital in Medina de Pomar, a unique case in late medieval and early modern Iberia, and is presented by Elena Paula Montero, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Art History of the Complutense University of Madrid since 2 years. She had been postdoctoral fellow in Madrid and in Florence before, and her research is devoted to patronage, gender studies, and transcultural artistic exchanges during the late Middle Ages in the Iberian Peninsula. Secondly, there is Marta Vicera Bravo, who's postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Historical Research of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And thirdly, Raúl Villagrasa Elias is a pre-doctoral fellow at the Institute of the History of the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid and a PhD candidate in the University of Zaragoza. So, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for this very nice presentation. Let me see if I can put the PowerPoint completely. So now you should see full screen, right? It's everything okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you for the presentation, and thank you also to the organizers for allowing us to be here presenting our research. That it's, as you could see, a common research between 3 investigators who we are moving around this hospital from different point of view. So I'm an art historian. Marta, she's art historian too, but she works more on manuscripts, and Raúl, who is a historian and historian of institutions. And thank you also to all the attendants to this late afternoon session. As you see, we will present this hospital, which is a rather unique case in the, as you can see in a minute. So in 1436, Pedro Fernández de Velasco, the powerful Count of Haro, founded the Hospital of the Holy Cross in Medina de Pomar, which is this city here marked, located north of Burgos. And it's a city that until the end of the Middle Ages kept its population under the 2,000 inhabitants. The general area was a complex and fragmented territory with great geostrategic importance, since it connected the center of Castile with the northern ports. The Velasco family was able to keep there a large lordship, and Medina de Pomar functioned as the political and symbolic center of this lordship. There, the ancestors of the Count had erected the main palace of the lineage, where they kept the family archive and the main treasure, and they also founded a poor clerks monastery, where the majority of the family members were buried. Associated with this poor clerks monastery, the Count of Haro founded a highly singular hospital. The general characteristics of this institution were common to other Christian hospitals of the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Charity towards the poor, the pilgrims, and the sick, a varied professional team that included a doctor, surgeon, administrator, female nurses, a scribe, and a chaplain, and the existence of an account books and foundational ordinances for a better administration. However, we consider it to be a singular example for several reasons. First, because this hospital served as a retreat for the Count, one of the main political figures of the Kingdom of Castile in the 15th century. Second, because for centuries it housed one of the largest libraries of manuscript books in the Iberian Peninsula. And third, because it housed also a community of poor elderly noblemen whose prayers honored the founder and his lineage. As you can see, this was a complex and quite sophisticated institution that we hope to continue investigating. The spatial dimensions of the complex are very rich and include the architecture, its position in a religious complex, the territorial role of the hospital, which was key in the civic organization of the lordship, and its position in the social structure of the time, as we will see in a minute. It was both center of a chivalric order and part of the Velasco lineage project of self-representation. For our paper today, we will focus in this specific aspect of the configuration of a social space and the interplay between sponsorship and architecture. From an institutional point of view, the hospital can be related to the city of Burgos and the Castilian court. Pedro Fernández de Velasco, the Count of Haro, for his foundation, this imitation of the royal model is something that was also remarkable for a noble foundation at the time. Pedro Fernández de Velasco reproduced the same hospital model. On the one hand, in both hospitals lived a community composed of poor elderly noblemen. On the other hand, the administration of the hospital corresponded in both cases to a female monastery. In both Burgos and Medina de Pomar, we find a construction complex composed mainly of two buildings. First, the hospital, and second, the female monastery that administered it. Both buildings were part of an architectural program at the service of the founder's lineage, whether royal or a noble family, and a memorial and propagandistic program. The same model of hospital with a community of elderly people and a female monastery was even reproduced on a second occasion at the beginning of the 16th century by Mencia de Velasco, who was the granddaughter of our Count, and she founded a very similar hospital in the city of Briviesca. Unfortunately, the hospital in Medina de Pomar was abandoned in the 18th century, and the architecture suffered greatly during 2 centuries. It was quite recently restored, but much of its ancient structures have now been lost, and the detailed reconstruction of the spaces and functioning of the hospital is very, very complicated. As many other hospitals at the time, so you can see a more encouraging picture on the right after the restoration. So as many other hospitals at the time, the Holy Cross Hospital was articulated around a courtyard with 2 levels of galleries with segmental arches and a carved parapets. a spiral stairway that you can see here connected the two levels of the hospital. The north part of the building that you can see, sorry, I lost my pointer. The north part that you can see here was adjacent to the church of the monastery that you can actually find here. And written documents state that there was, that in this part, there was the chapel of the hospital together with the sacristy. There was a direct communication through a window that connected the hospital chapel with the presbytery of the monastic church, allowing the elderly and the sick to assist to the mass in the church without leaving the hospital's facility. And you can see also how this window was actually preserved after the 17th century restorations of the monastic church. On the ground level, there were two big fireplaces that served the kitchen and also warmed the upper rooms. Those rooms, according to the scarce written sources that have been preserved, would probably be the Count of Aro's private rooms and also the wards where the beds for poor and sick would be placed, divided by gender. These European hospitals at that time, according to the regulatory documents, and as it can be seen in many representations of the hospitals here, due to the two most famous hospitals of Rome and Lyon. However, the singularities of this hospital also impacted its spatial arrangement. First, we need to take into account that the main inhabitants of the hospital were not especially sick people, but elderly and impoverished knights that, according to the ordinance, were the main group of residents. These impoverished knights must have served to the house of Velasco. These selected people were permanent residents opposed to a much smaller group of sick people that were allowed to be there only temporarily. They constituted a prestigious entourage that combined loyalty, knighthood values, elderly wisdom, and poverty, and fitted the image of pious knight that the Count of Aro crafted throughout his life. Their daily lives in the hospital were regulated by the Book of Ordinance established by the Count in 1455, a document which was lavishly illuminated with a representation of the Count himself, you can see here, tracing some kind of purple, and surrounded by those poor knights under the foot of the cross. Secondly, the Count constructed in this hospital a residential area for himself, where he retired to live a semi-monastic life together with his poors at the age of 60, while his wife did the same with the nuns in the Poor Clares Monastery. Furthermore, the Count decided to create his own chivalric order, the Order of the Holy Cross, one of the first noble chivalric orders created in Castile. The order will have its devotional and administrative center in this very hospital, where a fragment of the Vera Croce was venerated in a reliquary situated in the chapel of the hospital. The existence of a permanent community of residents, poor and elderly knights living under a quasi-monastic rule, the construction of a residential area for the Count, and the foundation of the chivalric order of the Holy Cross explain the existence of yet another unusual space for a late medieval hospital in Castile, a very magnificent library. In the mentioned Book of Ordinances of 1455, the Count included a detailed inventory of items written in first person that he decided to donate to the hospital. It is within this inventory that the earliest mention to the library of the Holy Cross Hospital appears. This inventory contains a list of 80 donated books, signed individually with red pilcrows and organized by language and material support. Thus, in the middle of the 15th century, the library was organized in the following fashion: books in paper or parchment, Romance books in paper or parchment, and lastly, books in French. If we quickly review the items in this inventory, however, the first thing that catches our eye is that there is not a single book on medicine, something that was somehow expected to be in a hospital. Why did the Count decide to create a library in the recently founded family institution? In the Ordinance of 1455, we find maybe an answer. In a paragraph just above the list of books, it says that the library was created as a source for devotional readings. This is why we can find books of moral issues, such as the Commentary on Job by Gregory the Great, of course the Bible, several missals and breviaries, as well as reading focused on inner spirituality, such as Augustine's Soliloquies. Yet, if we continue reading this inventory, many of its books show little to no connection with Christian devotion. We can find legal texts, as the Siete Partidas, or historical chronicles of the kingdom, together with several works on chivalric values, such as Regimiento de Príncipes, the Tree of Battles, or the questions about chivalry. Thus, this was a library focused not only on devotional matters, but which allow its readers to learn about history, military strategy, and about the rule and government of people. But who would be the readers of such books, and how did they use the library? As we have already indicated, the main requirement for admittance was clear: men that served militarily under the banner of the Velasco family. If we add this to the devotional and chivalric nature of the books mentioned above, we might think of a library created as a place of retirement from the public life, where the Count would be surrounded by his old companions. Indeed, this idea is supported by some evidence inside one of the books in the hospital's library. The item number 44 in the inventory of donated books was El Libro de Seneca de la Providencia de Dios, the book of Seneca on divine providence. In its end sheet, they were used the decrees, and we can see that it's in a different ink and a different handwriting. They were used the decrees establishing the foundation of the new chivalric order of the Holy Cross. In these folios, we read the names of its male and female members, and maybe we can think that the members of the order were the dedicatees of the library, or maybe they were the dedicatees of the library were the actors of the hospital. It is clear that the hospital was not intended as a place of residence for relatives of the Count, or a place of residence for the members of the chivalric order, but it was focused on the health and well-being of the poor hidalgos and as a residence of the Count exclusively. However, it was in of the chivalric order and the place of residence of the Count that we can think he would receive people and have his own entourage there. The library was perfectly organized, as shown by the 5 inventories of its books that have survived, and we would like to highlight 2 of them. The first was composed in 1553, and it constitutes the second largest donation to the library that reached a total of 160 books in the mid of the 16th century. The second inventory is also the most recent and dates from 1726. However, its late composition, it allows us to reconstruct vaguely the space of the library, locating them in the library's different shelves. The current state of the hospital makes it impossible to ascertain the original location of this collection of books, but we can somehow imagine the magnificent space. The specific themes of the books, the involvement of the Count of Arrow in the selection of titles, the devotional use, as well as the interest for chivalric themes, together with the continuous preoccupation for members of their family over the centuries, undoubtedly make this library another key element to understand the Holy Cross Hospital as a complex unique in its time. The last particularity of this hospital that we want to highlight today is its connection with the monastery and the Velasco's funerary vault, which gave this hospital an important role in the memorial strategies of the lineage. As we have seen, both monuments, the hospital and the monastery, were physically and administratively connected, and in the minutes that we have left, we will comment how they were also spiritually and symbolically intertwined. The Poor Clares Monastery had been founded by the Count's ancestors in 1313. During the first century of development, maybe Velasco's had ordered to be buried there, and certainly all the heads of the lineage were resting there. The Count, at the same time that he ordered the construction of the hospital, decided to renovate completely the church of the monastery. And you can see here the different phases of renovation, and this one is the renovation under the Count of Arrow. And so he decided to renovate completely the church, enlarging and modernizing its architecture, and he reorganized the funerary space. He moved the bodies of his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, and the monastery founders to the presbytery, and he eliminated the rest of the family members that were not part of the main patrilineal lineage. He displayed the linearity and continuity of his lineage, much in tune with other noble families in Castile that started written genealogies at that time. The nuns, of course, were charged with the memorial management of the lineage. They had to pray in the anniversaries of death and perform charity deeds in the name of the deceased benefactor. Also integrated in that memorial management the poor of the hospital. They had to pray for the salvation of the founder and his ancestors' souls. And their prayers through the window of the presbytery would physically fall over the tombs of all of them. They also participated in the funerary rituals that the Count decided to be performed on his behalf in his last will. And the poor would move from the hospital to the monastery through the inner corridors and connecting those two spaces through their ritual movements. The badges and the heraldry of the Velasco family and the personal emblem of the Count that was the St. Andrew's Cross also unified both spaces. We know by the ordinances book that those emblems appear also in the curtains surrounding the beds of the poor, as well as in the headboards. The St. Andrew's Cross, which was also the emblem of the chivalric order of the Count, appear also on the habits worn by the permanent residents of the hospital, the elderly hidalgos, as actually they were represented here in the first page of the Book of Ordinances. In conclusion, in this very quick overview, we can see how the Hospital of the Holy Cross was a highly complex space. There, the memorial, the sanitary, the spiritual, the charitable, and the chivalric dimensions were intertwined in a charged social space that was shaped by both the needs of the founders and the daily life of its residents. Architecture, heraldry, iconography, librarian culture, religion, and health were combined in one of the most unique spaces of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, most of all, for this brilliant paper and for perfectly keeping the time. So this was an easy job for me, and I step over to introduce our next presenter, which is Zera Tombul from Istanbul, talking on hospitals as socio-political spaces, mapping hospitals in late Ottoman Empire. And Zera is in Istinye University, I hope this is spelled at least understandable, of the Istanbul Faculty of Fine Arts, Design and Architecture, where she is an assistant professor of history and theory of architecture. Her research focuses on the turn of the century intellectual history from the point of view of art and architecture. And she published a book 10 years ago, which is in Turkish language, but it's we need to know, on the first civil hospital buildings of Turkey. So she's our perfect guest here. And Zera, we're awaiting your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me in this conference. Let me share. Okay. My paper aims to map the sociopolitics of the first civil hospital buildings in the Ottoman Empire from mid-19th century onwards. My presentation is a revisit of a survey I undertook about 10 years ago, traveling around Turkey, tracing the stories of these hospitals. The survey depicted that the memory of these buildings existed mainly as part of urban histories, as means of social solidarity under trying conditions of epidemics and war. I will present these hospitals through a topographical reading of their cities and also later as means of imperial identification. The establishment of these buildings marks a transformation from health complexes of medieval inheritance called Darüşşifas, houses of healing. The construction of these medieval health complexes by Selçuk and later Ilkhanid statesmen and women served to create an urban and socio-political topography throughout Asia Minor. They were part of urban complexes, either next to a mosque or a madrasa, which is a theological school. So here is an example from Amasya, and here is an example from Sivas. Not all exist, of course. The political centralization under the Ottoman Empire dismissed this diffused topography, and new Darüşşifas were built in the palatial centers as part of bigger imperial complexes in Istanbul, Bursa, Edirne, and Manisa. So this is in Edirne. This is the one by Sultan Beyazıt in Edirne. And this is the most famous one by architect Sinan in Istanbul, Süleymaniye. And on the Darüşşifa, the health center is at the bottom left. And there is schools, there is a kitchen, and there's a mosque, and there is a madrasa, again, a theological school in the compound, in the complex. There was an activity of hospital building, as I try to map here, that would reform cities and urban topographies in the second half of the 19th century, with war and epidemics at several fronts of the empire. The first hospital, with the title of Hastahane, would be built in Istanbul by the mother of Sultan Abdülmecit after a smallpox epidemic in 1843. This first building continued the tradition of medieval Darüşşifas, being led by a patronage based on a vakıf foundation system, yet was a singular building and not part of a complex. It would treat patients free of charge, and its regulations were secured by a religious ethical framework inscribed on stone. If anyone changes the bequest after hearing it, the guilt shall be on those who make the change, for Allah hears and knows. As the verse states, they deserve punishment in the world and hereafter. Its name, Gureba Hospital, appears an adaptation of the hospitals for the poor in Europe, as the word Gureba denotes the poor, the orphans, the needy, and the estranged. This name would be adapted in all the following hospital buildings. A second Gureba Hospital was built in 1849 in another city of the Ottoman Empire, the cosmopolitan port city of Izmir or Smyrna. It was built after an endowment of land by the British Embassy under the condition that a hospital was to be built. The land was previously a cemetery where the British soldiers from the Crimean War were buried, after which they were carried back to Britain. This hospital was built with the support of Sultan Abdülmecit and with a revenue system similar to a vakıf system, foundation system. It was also sustained by inventive measures of the hospital: rose water produced in the distillery, the money received for the burial of the dead, money taken from the property fund for prisoners treated in the hospital. There followed others throughout a wider topography, and as products of their cities, in the sense they were results of a social solidarity movement led by a governor in face of war and urgent needs, the inhabitants taking roles in their financing and also building. This one that you will see the opening ceremony of, a photograph from the opening ceremony, was constructed in the aftermath of the Ottoman-Russian War with the efforts of its mayor, Şerif Efendi, who also collected money from the villagers and sometimes forced them to work, while he also carried stones with them. In Balıkesir, similarly, a Grupal hospital was built under similar conditions of epidemics after the efforts of its governor. This one from Konya served the surrounding provinces of Antalya, Isparta, Niğde, and was the main basis of the malaria epidemics that took place between 1979 and 1923, and 70% of Konya's population was affected. We know from an image in a newspaper that there is an existing, there was a Grupal hospital with the public taking place in its opening ceremony and publicized in the newspaper. And other Grupal hospitals expanded this new urban topography in different scales and dimensions. One in Çankırı, one in Sinop, one in Manisa, and again in Manisa, in Antalya. Hospitals, however, soon became means of an imperial agenda. A first signifier of this shift was the renaming of the buildings after Sultan Abdülhamit. First time in Istanbul, a port city, in Samsun, a port city on the Black Sea, a hospital was constructed under the name Hamidiah Hospital. Similar to other hospitals, it was planned by a commission led by the governor, financed by public donation, and included the taxing of tobacco production in the city, which was under French management. So these are nurses and the doctors from a later time. In Urfa, a hospital was attributed with both Hamidiye, the imperial, and Grupal titles. We see other Hamidiye Grupal Hospital in Nyanya, present Greece. This is an image of the Hamidiye Hospital in its opening ceremony in Bursa. And here is again one in Manisa. Yet here you see the hospitals, especially in Bursa and Manisa, as part of an album. This is one of about 40,000 photos in about 900 photo albums prepared for Sultan Abdülhamit. These albums depicted different aspects of life on Ottoman lands, and hospitals took a main role. The albums appear to reconstruct the unity of the empire through photographic visual means, depicting a modernized empire, a visual topography of its buildings and people. They were prepared mainly for Sultan's own viewing and or for posterity as means of knowledge on the empire. Looking, this is in Konya, again in the Yıldız albums, the imperial albums. Again, Konya, Aydın. So most of these buildings don't exist. We have a memory of them through this imperial memory within the photographic albums of Sultan Abdülhamit, Edirne, Kavala, which is in present Greece, Bursa, Karahisar, Aegean region. And this is in, looking at these albums, we see buildings also represented in topographies and landscapes, not only in urban environments, in different topographies. So I will quickly pass through the album. So a hospital in rural Paraköy. So all of these were included as rural and urban, within rural and landscapes and urban landscapes of the empire. This is a port hospital. This is in present Alexandropolis. Well, not every time, but this one includes a plan of it as well. Again in Alexandropolis. This one is in the Balkans again, in present Bulgaria. Yeah. So this is in Damascus. This is in Yemen. And this is in Thessaloniki, Salonika. There are two main hospitals with particular depictions in the albums and are financed by Sultan Abdülhamit himself. One is the Hamidiah Hospital in Salonika, which is still used today, to my knowledge, with the name Hagia Dimitrios, after the name of patron saint of Thessaloniki. And the other is Hamidiah et FLUL, Hamidiah Children's Hospital in Istanbul. The photographic depiction of these hospitals, the two hospitals, includes detailed photographs of their place in the city, their architecture from different viewpoints, depicting facades, courtyards, gardens, interior spaces such as corridors, patient wards, kitchen, dining rooms, doctor rooms, X-ray rooms, labs. The depictions, as you will in a minute see, will expand to include doctors, nurses, as well as the patients and their treatments in a scenographic manner. Curiously, for Sultan's view, deeming Sultan's view not only topographical, but also almost anthropological. So here is the hospital at the center here in the port of Thessaloniki, Salonika. Its opening ceremony. And just probably the photos were probably taken just after the construction. And here is the different views of its architecture, its courtyards, different views from its courtyards, different facades, main facades. Further out, we're showing it within a landscape. Another one. And also interiors. This is the reception room of the hospital, the furniture. Again, from the reception room. This is a doctor on duty room. Sorry, let me just. This is a doctor on duty room. This is a special patients room. Corridors. Another corridor. This is operating room. This is the lab, the pharmacy. This is the photograph of the pharmacy, the kitchen, and garden kiosks written in the album for the use of the patients that have an interesting architectural manner. And here again. So we have also photographs of the people working, nurses, the pharmacists. These are the doctors, the management. So we have also photos from the ward. This is from the women's ward. This is from another, and the men's ward again. There is a photo of a surgical operation undertaken in the hospital. And this is Hamidiah et FLUL, the children's hospital in Istanbul. Salonika had an economic and geographic significance in the late Ottoman Empire as its second biggest port. Hamidiah et FLUL, the photo of which we see here, expands Sultan's view socially to children, women, and the wounded, as the war-beaten were also treated here, and also women. So let me just go through the images of this hospital in the albums. Opening ceremonies, again, reception rooms, dining room, the chief doctor, the opening again, the different, pavilions, let's say, for the children. It's how it is viewed within an urban topography. This is, I don't really remember what this was, sorry, but this is an X-ray room, a photo from the X-ray room. These are patients that are being treated there, mostly patients that got injured, wounded in the war. There is a surgical operation here with the name of the doctor mentioned within the album. The children, the photo of the children in the hospital, and the children with their nurses who were German. The hospital was built after a German model, and the nurses were also invited from there. So there is a bacteriology lab, a surgical operation to a child by Ziya Nuri Bey, and a doctor in a children's ward. And well, further images from, so one is colored from the outside, women waiting to be treated, another one. The character of the representation of the hospitals depict at one hand the social role played by hospitals during the late Ottoman Empire, but at the same time, they are means of a social and visual memory of the imperial history and topography. So this we have photos of this almost anthropological photos of the treated, and these are patients from the war. So mentioned as a woman with two children, one wounded man with his children, women, again, women. The albums may be viewed as a modernized version of Ottoman imperial albums, a visual imperial image-making strategy. Recently, a book by Emine Fetvacı was published on an album dating to the beginning of 17th century, compiled for the Ottoman Sultan Ahmet I. The album's title was Album of the World Emperor Sultan Ahmet Han, may God perpetuate his kingdom until doomsday, Amen. Fetvacı interprets the album as a microcosm of the world over which the Sultan ruled. She further interprets it as means of connoisseurship of arts, as a sign of imperial prowess. Abdülhamit's Yıldız albums were reflective of contemporaneous photographic representation of the world and its cultures, found to the utmost extent in colonial photography. Hospitals thus were physical and social centers of cities, and thereafter means of reconstructing an imperial topography geographically, socially, and also visually. In the time of 50 years, the religious philanthropic background to the first hospital building, reminiscent of the medieval tradition of Darüşşafas, took on social and political roles in their cities, and also became part of an overall imperial representation. I want to expand my query into why and how these hospitals became part of an imperial gaze and a memory construction tool in the last years of the Ottoman Empire. I could leave it there, or I have an aftermath of how Hamidian endeavor would end with the constitutional reform in 1908, yet the hospitals continued to function throughout the new national geography, with a change of names that would indicate their then national identity. All Greba and Hamidiah hospitals were renamed as Memleket hospitals, a political appropriation designating a new understanding of the land as the property of its people. So Balıkesir, so this urban topography continued with as a continuation of the previous hospitals, as one in Balıkesir was constructed again by the governor, but could only be completed after First World War. Aydın Memleket Hospital, established by a doctor, but it became a Greek army post during the First World War. Kayseri Memleket Hospital, started in 1910, only to be completed in 1925. Manisa Memleket Hospital, as an endowment of Maurice Şinasi, a the Morris of the Tobacco Company, Philip Morris, who was born here and a native of Manisa, who had emigrated to the United States. Their names continued to change as they developed and as the politics changed. They became millet hospitals, people's hospitals in the 1940s, state hospitals in the 1950s, and recently, this is again Tokat Memleket, this is Uşak Memleket, this is another Memleket, the national, the nationalized naming of the same tradition of hospitals. And recently, we have a Memleket Hastanesi in the memory of the early years of the Republic and later years of the Ottoman Empire, appropriated in a city in Bursa. So this, thank you. This was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another paper which perfectly kept the time. And there's maybe another sad news, as we haven't found the next presenter, Narcisse Sorabi from the University of Paris in this round. So if you are here, Narcisse, could you just turn on your screen or something like this? Well, doesn't look like she's here. So even if it had been a perfect way to go over from the Ottoman Empire to the medical spaces in Iran, we just open the discussion now. So please give your questions in the chat, and maybe I start with one question comparing the papers. One of the oldest and nearly classical questions in social history of hospitals is how wealth or poorness really was measured, because all hospitals in nearly all times always claim that they mostly are dedicated to the poor. And in the first paper, we had the poor knights. How could noblemen get poor in the strict sense of the word? So to both presenters, had there been any measures to control the wealth or the poorness of the people coming in the hospital? Had there been something in the ordinances, or are there any rules to verify which kind of poor people finally entered the hospital?
If I may start, well, it's also about the imperial socio-political system of Ottoman Empire. I don't have a direct knowledge on it. I don't have a direct research on it. But the rich, there was the social economic system in the Ottoman Empire. There were only bureaucrats, and then there were people. And the bureaucrats were also the army men, statesmen. So the wealth was quite clearly set. So there were not a very big spectrum to judge. Those who had money would be treated privately, probably, and the hospitals would probably used by the millet. I do not want to, by the people, by the subjects of the Sultan.
Well, related to our paper about nobility, if they became poor, yes, because nobility was a concept so wide and so big that could be so many people involved. For example, the Fernandez de Velasco, this family, they never became poor. They were rich. They had an amazing patrimony and different towns and cities under their control. And of course, they never used the hospital as a medical center or a charity center. And all the rules or ideas that we know, we understand that these people were so connected to the family because they have fought together, or even people that work together, maybe not just night, but this is the main characteristic of these people inside the hospital that we think. And yes, they could be noble people, especially in the north of the Spanish kingdoms, in Aragon, in Catalonia, in Castile. They were called hidalgos. These people was part of the low nobility. So they, in the past, they could have a horse, they could vote, but maybe in the 15th, 16th century, we have a few examples of a specific hospitals dedicated to these people, because it's like they were truly poor people. They really need the help because they were really good Christians and they were naturals of these villages. But this is the only idea that we have to classify these nobles.
Okay, thank you. Just to keep in mind for all of us that hospitals are one of the definitive places where the social definition of what poorness means in a given historical society is done. So this is a major aspect of the social spaces of hospitals. So there is a commentary and a question from Sarah, most of all to Elena. I found very similar situations in the almshouses of London in the 15th century, she wrote. Some of these also had access to libraries, and many had the founders living with the almspeople. Do you think the works of spiritual mercy, particularly in relation to the libraries to instruct the ignorant, might be relevant here? Perhaps the Count was working through all the works of mercy, both bodily and spiritual, in his foundation and demonstrating his superior understanding of spirituality.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think definitely the Count was working on the works of mercy, but I am not sure this goes in that, the library in specific goes in that direction. I don't know if maybe Raul wants to start with something about the special characteristics of the institution, and then I can go.
Okay, well, about this, as for the retirement of elderly people, yes, I think this is common in other kingdoms in Europe. We know cases of married couples or people alone who choose a hospital for their retirement. Thinking in the two senses about care for the old age, but also as a preparation for death and salvation. But we don't know as many cases, as you say, Sarah, that the founders retired in their own institutions, could be hospital or almshouses. And as for the libraries, the curious thing is not the presence of books, because I think it was more or less what's common, see 1, 2, 3 religious books. For us, I think that the value is the quantity and the quality and the variety of the books.
Yeah, if I can add, so we do think that this is a space of formation of like young generations, or even a memorial of the glorious past of the Count, a place for learning history, a place for learning law, but it's not a place of instruction for the ignorant, because the books are highly complex and they are very, very fine. So it is not a place of formation of the ignorance. It's definitely a place of formation, and also for the preparation of the soul of both the poor and the count himself. But not in that sense of instructing the ignorance. I think it's a more sophisticated library. We think that it's a more sophisticated library rather than that.
And if I can add something, between this 12, 13 old people, they could be illiterate knights, but one of these people was a priest. And we suppose that this is especially for the devotional readings dedicated to the soul of the family and the soul of the founder. And this is more or less common, I think, in other contexts in Europe.
Thank you. I have two more questions to the library, so I'm going to add that just now. First of all, had there been a public library? Had there been guests just to read the books in the time? And the second question, where are the books now and the manuscripts?
Okay, so it was not really a public library, since it was a library of the institution, and it was mostly reserved for the people living there. But we do know that there were also guests of the count visiting the library and copying the manuscripts. So we know, for example, about Diego Valera, who was a very well-known intellectual of the time, going there, copying books, sharing books. So there was an intellectual activity going on there. And the majority of the books are now in the National Library of Madrid. So there's a complicated history of the library that Marta Bírseda has studied in her doctoral dissertation, but mostly they are in the National Library now.
Thank you. There are two questions regarding the architecture of the hospitals mentioned by Zera. Joana Pinho asks, what are the main architectural references for the design of these hospitals? And I add just the next question, which is from John Henderson, who asks, given that some of the hospitals were founded at the time of the outbreak of epidemic diseases, did this lead to different architectural designs?
Thank you for the questions. Well, there is a variety. The main inspiration is Europe, because they are modern, they are at the same time representations of Ottoman modernization. It depended, however, the spectrum shows us that it also depended on money collected or the patronage of these hospitals. For example, in Salonika, the patron is Sultan himself, and it is probably done by in a neoclassical style. In Hamidiah Etfal, it's again the patronage is Sultan himself, belongs to Sultan himself, and it is though a copy or a sort of adaptation of a German children's hospital. In Erzurum, in the case of Erzurum, which it appears because it's next to the Russian frontier, and Kars at that time was a Russian city. Russians took over the neighboring city of in the Caucasus, Kars. It looks more after the Russian examples. But in Çankırı, the one is it's in the more smaller the dimension ones are after traditional. We have examples of traditional Ottoman hospitals that are used as buildings for these hospitals. I do not know if how the epidemics influence. They are sort of. I believe it depends. They are sometimes the urgency created the barrack-like architecture we saw, but the representative aspects of some of those. And even in Erzurum, I believe there is a representative aspect against the Russians. We can also, it's the Russian frontier there. So there is a representative aspect. So it's beyond the urgency of the epidemics itself. So I think the variety is quite large. But yeah, European examples is the most simple way to interpret it, I suppose.
Okay, I'm just seeing that Ugo Tunch wants to take the word. Is it possible that he unmutes?
Hi, it's a she actually. And I just about epidemics and infectious diseases and hospital typology in the Ottoman Empire. I just wanted to add something about that. So the Hamidiah FLUL was actually founded in response to the Sultan Abdülhamid's daughter dying of typhoid. And so there was a response to infectious diseases, but the response came rather late. There was, as much as I know, another hospital being built in Haydarpaşa, which was interrupted. It was connected to the military medical school, but the Abdülhamid saw this hospital and the medical school as a threat to his authority, and he saw it as a potential breeding ground for dissidents. And so the hospital's construction project was interrupted. Hamidiah FLUL, which was the construction, I believe, was completed in 1899, or maybe Zehra might know the exact date. So it was the first pavilion style hospital, and it came rather late. Yeah. So I mean, I guess like you were referring to the miasmatic theory, and who was asking that question, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Thank you. What do we have next? We have Anna Peterson for Elena, and she wrote, you commented that it was odd and that the inventory did not contain medical texts. However, are there examples of hospitals in that period that have and use medical texts? The library reads much like a foundation of the hospital as a demonstration of their authority and prestige. Nicholas of Cusa founded a hospital in Kos in 1401, and he donated his library to his foundation in an effort to educate the patients. He also had his heart buried there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you're raising a very, very important point. So yes, the fact that there is no medical text in the library is not in itself so odd. And Raul was pointing at me before that we only know a library from a hospital at this time in Iberia that has medical texts in Girona. He knows more than me about this, so you can direct the next questions to him. But the special thing is that we have a pretty huge library for the time, even for a novel library. So we have almost 100 books there, and not even one of them is slightly related with any medical questions, not even practical questions. And yeah, library, much like the foundation, is a demonstration of authority and prestige. And as we said before, also it has this memorial part of it. But it is also interesting to think that at least the first library, the first inventory of the library, it was not a donation of the whole library of the Count to the hospital. It was a selection of books from his library. So the Count was selecting specifically some books from his huge library to be donated to the hospital. So he selected devotional works, but he selected also these kind of law and chivalric and historical books. So we can read, I think, a purpose there, and I agreed, and we agree that it's more about authority, about prestige, about formation also, and this kind of memorial and rememorating the glorious past of the count.
If I may to add something, I also think that the role of the doctors and surgeons, they visit the hospital. They don't live in the hospital. They don't are all the time on the hospital. So maybe we have medical text, but maybe in other contexts. For example, universities, for example, their homes, but not in the hospital, because they just come to the hospital once or twice and they go. And the idea that we have of the hospital as a training center, I think in Spain it doesn't arrive until the beginning of the 16th century in the big hospitals. And this connection also between hospitals and university. And the only example that I know is in Girona, in the north of Catalonia. In the 14th century, I think we also have an inventory, and there are a few books like an Avicena or something like this. But also we have the inventories for Valencia for the 14th century, and in this case, it's also a library very connected with the Franciscans order. So more or less, it is the same idea. All the books are related with devotion, prayer, and these kind of things.
Thank you. So some more questions for Elena. So first of all, Anna wrote these photographs were truly amazing, which every one of us will share. It's fantastic having, what did you say, 40,000 photographs. Incredible. And she asked, do we know what the Sultan's reaction to these images or to the hospitals was? And there's another question of Magnus Altschäfer, who adds to this, are there also pictures included of Jewish, French, European, etc. hospitals, or is this album exclusively with photographs of Ottoman hospitals?
Again, thank you. It's quite fascinating, these albums, and I do want to continue on understanding the reception mechanism and the production mechanism of this album. It's a collection mechanism as well. It's and the imperial mechanism as well. To my knowledge, the album is digitalized, and I searched through it. And there were a lot of military hospitals, which I didn't include because I wanted to concentrate on the civil hospitals. But to my knowledge, hospitals of minorities or Jewish, French, which existed, British, and also missionary hospitals, of course, which also existed in the Ottoman lands, weren't included. Greba, Hamidiah hospitals were included, as well as these two almost anthropological depictions of the specific two hospitals. And another women's hospital, again, constructed in Istanbul. The Sultan, how the Sultan produced, well, the Sultan commissioned photographers and also I think about 200 photographers from all over the empire contributed to this album. And to my knowledge, again, these were kept for his view in the palace, in the Yıldız Palace, and the albums are thus named Yıldız albums, the name of the palace. And they were sent to the British and also to the United States that I know of in two instances. And I came across a paper on which now exists in the British Library. Of course, he made a choice of what to represent to the British. In that, and what I saw is what he represented there was almost touristic photos of Istanbul, Izmir, port cities, the mosques. There is only one photo from a hospital, none of the buildings. There is always one photo of a hospital that he mentions, from mentioning the British Library. So it was a choice what to present them. And there were, of course, the military endeavors, the military men, the military hospitals, the military power was represented in those albums. And they were, what I found interesting was they were presented to be put in a library, in the British Library. So they weren't a private present to my knowledge, as I read from the paper, they weren't presented to the embassy, to the private library of the embassy, but to the library itself. So there is this interesting occupation thought of remaining to posterity, a memory building process as well through these albums, which I find fascinating.
Thank you. Every one of us found that fascinating what you presented, and of course also what Elena, Raul, and Marta presented here. So it looks like everyone is getting a little tired, and the questions are running out in the chat. Any more questions? So I might give the word to Edita and Anna to have the very short closing word for the day. And thank you very much for your papers, and thank you very much for the discussion from me.
Thank you for your sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fritz. And thank you, everyone, for your wonderful papers. Yes, so this is the conclusion for today. Thank you so much for your contribution and your stamina. I know this makes for an extremely long day if you've been here from the beginning, or even if you've just joined. So tomorrow is our last day. I know that's very sad, but all good things must come to an end. So please join us tomorrow. I've sent out the links. If you are missing them for any reason, send me an email. I will resend them to you. They're also in the chat down below. And we begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. Lisbon time. And you should show up because I'm chairing. Not that that's anything special, but all right. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your attention, your contribution, and your amazing questions. I look forward to see all of your smiling faces tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Rest.